Welcome. It's very nice to see a packed house. And entirely deservedly so. So I'm Neville Hode. I teach in the English department and I'm co-director of the sector here in the law school with Karen Engel, without whom not much happens. I'm very excited for today's faculty affiliate book talk. It was supposed to happen on snow day, but like all good things, it's worth waiting for. Before we get started, I have a few thanks. I want to thank Representative staff, especially Brianna Silva, who is our senior communications associate, who does all the beautiful promotional materials you see. Maya Borshard, who is the program coordinator and definitely earns that title. Cooper Christiansi, our chief of operations, who was instrumental in getting this event together, and Blake Roker, the director of the Sissy Parental Reproductive Justice Defense Project in Paso and Ciudad. I'm going to give you a little bit more info about the Sissy Parental Defense Fund. Our talk today features the celebrated book of one of our newest faculty affiliates, Professor Lina-Maria Murillo, from the Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies. And I want to say that again, the Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies. Faculty affiliate book talks are the perfect introduction to the Rebouché Center because they showcase the interdisciplinary ethos that is central to our work, to your own. So we're really glad to have you aboard, and we're very glad to. I won't ask how many of you schlepped from the other side of campus. A long walk or a short bus ride, but thanks to those of you who did. Professor Murillo is a Latina feminist historian whose work and research interests include Latina health activism, reproductive justice, care, reproductive violence, a whole range of incredibly pressing issues for our present. She joined us from the University of Iowa, and we're very, very she is going to speak today about her book, Fighting for Control, Reproductive Care, Race and Power in the US-Mexico Borderlands, published by the University of North Carolina Press last year. The book shows how Mexican origin women living in the border cities of El Paso and Juárez had confronted various interest groups determined to control their reproductive lives, including a heavily funded international population control campaign led by Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as well as the Catholic Church and Mexican American activists. In the works of scholar Vicky Ruiz, Professor Murillo's book fuses, and I'm quoting, I think this is a very nice description, fuses feminist theory, archival sleuthing, and compelling storytelling to craft an unparalleled history of women's reproductive health care in the US-Mexico borderlands. Okay, Professor Maria is going to shortly, I'm going to finish quickly, we'll give a presentation of her book, and then a response from Professor Rachel Rebouché, and then we're going to hear from Professor Rebouché is G. Rollie White Chair in Law and Professor at the Texas School of Law. She's a leading scholar in reproductive rights and health, and she serves as the faculty lead of the Sissy Parental Reproductive Justice Defense Project. Okay, you've heard the name Sissy Parental pop up a few times this morning already. Okay, this event is part of our Sissy at 100 celebrations. So we're doing a very good imitation of Starbucks or stole it from, I don't know, those childhood sticky games. Pick up one of these postcards, they're over here, and a stamp, and you get to put a stamp every time you come. Don't lose it. Professor Maria's book encapsulates many of the inspirations Sissy cited for her own advocacy. She started her career as director of Nueces County Legal Aid, seeing firsthand the struggle of poor women and their children, many of them of Mexican origin. One of our guiding lights at the Rebouché Center, sort of a tireless and fearless advocate for a whole range of justice issues in Texas, nationally and globally. So welcome, and without further ado, let's give a round of applause to Professor Lina-Maria Murillo.
Thank you. So generous. Generous introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry if I seem a little bit, I just power walked from, I was one of those people, I just power walked from across campus. But thank you so much for this wonderful invitation to Pensacola Law School. And just a huge shout out to the work that the Rappaport Center is doing. It's so needed right now. And importantly, one of the things that I am beginning to see as I round out my first year at UT is the incredible solidarity of my colleagues across this campus, especially for those of us that are in departments that I don't know if you all know this, but some of these departments are being consolidated, right? So the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, along with Mexican American, Latino Studies, African American Studies, and American Studies, and all of the centers and institutes that are connected to those spaces. And while we are under threat, I would argue that the reason why we're under threat is because the work that we're doing remains so critical, right? To the experiences of everyday people living in the state of Texas. And I hope that what my book is trying to do, will do, is to become like a marker in space for this moment. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that today. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the book and see if I can do this now. Where's the person? Here, yay. Perfect. That's perfect. This is kind of like 3 broad points, but I'm going to expand a little bit. This is kind of what I want to go over today. And I know that most of you all who are here will likely know some of these things, but that's okay. We'll just go over them very quickly. So one of the things I want to do is talk about the differences between reproductive justice and reproductive rights, and why I use a reproductive justice framework when looking at this project, and why I wrote about it. And in fact, in the first kind of few pages of the book, I do say very directly, I'm not talking about rights, I'm not concerned about rights, because the people that I'm talking about in the book are not talking about rights. They're talking about access to justice. And on the flip side, for many of the white women who are involved in the construction of the birth control movement along the border, they're concerned with control, the control of the reproductive health of Mexican origin people. And then I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about that history, but I know we don't have a lot of time. I really, really want to have a conversation with me and Professor Rebouché. That's really like my main goal is to hurry up and be quiet so we can talk together. And then the last thing, and we can probably talk about this more together, which is how do we identify reproductive injustice in our world today, and what can we do about it? And so the reason I say that, like, the book for me marks like this like important moment is that I want to step back and just kind of, you know, I know there's a lot of students here, so I want to kind of also honor you, so you have some idea of like how we do this, like how scholars do some of this work. I'm a historian, and despite what historians do, which is to look at the past, we are products of our present, right? And so I wrote this book, one, as I was, you know, and kind of created all the archives for the book. I was in, I went to UT El Paso, that's where I got my PhD. I had 2 kids. So let me tell you, it was really fascinating to give talks on birth control while being 8 months pregnant. And I mean, let me tell you about where I get triggered. People are like, oh my goodness, you are very, very pregnant. Yes, I am. So talking about birth control and talking about justice, thinking about what that meant as I was a graduate student in my late 20s, going through a program for those here who might be graduate students, where it's still not acceptable to be a person in your whole body and reproducing. I can't tell you the amount of comments I would get from mentors, potential mentors, about whether or not I was doing it the right way or the wrong way. Right? Like, oh, shouldn't you have waited to start a family? I think you want to do that while you're on your tenure track, whatever. Lots of opinions about my body, despite the fact that it was like, it's too late, I'm 8 months pregnant, like, so that's one thing that's going on. And then the other thing that's happening, right, is that we have the rise of MAGA, right? We have the rise where these folks are actively going to stifle, if not completely get rid of, access to reproductive health care. We will begin to define that for you, right? And so I'm writing my little dissertation as these things are happening, and it was impossible to disconnect myself, right? And in fact, I didn't want to. And when I came to understand the reproductive justice framework, not just as a movement, an activist movement, but to understand it as an intellectual way of grounding how I thought about my work. The women that I was writing about were mostly Mexican origin women along the US-Mexico border, roughly from around the turn of the 20th century. And then looking at their activism and work throughout the 20th century, roughly my book ends, it ends in 2018. Although the epilogue kind of, it's like to be continued, right? Like the story is still going into today. But trying to make sense of what they were demanding. And so as you can see here, right, this is just like a brief, like reproductive rights versus reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is a framework that was established by Black feminists in the 1990s. And then they came together with a group of women of color who were demanding, right, that abortion and questions around abortion not be the end-all be-all conversation around what reproductive services people might be able to avail themselves of. And recently, I was at a conference, a women's conference, it was a National Women's Studies Association conference, where Loretta Ross, who's one of the founders of RJ, like sat in on a panel, and we were like, oh, we were freaking out. But she's a delight. And it ended up just being a conversation between the group of students and some faculty, and then Loretta was in the room. And she said, you know, when we first came up with this framework of reproductive justice, it was because the majority of people who had shown up to talk, it was a women's health conference, the people that had shown up to talk about the conference didn't want to talk about abortion, they wanted to talk about menopause. And so I asked her, I said, why were you guys talking about menopause? Why was that something that came up for you? And she said, because the majority of us who are in the room had been sterilized very early on in our lives. We were some of the survivors of these sort of late 1970s eugenic sterilization campaigns. And so we were in our early, late 20s, early 30s, already going into menopause. And so for us, the question of abortion was not central, right? For us, the question was, one, we had been robbed of our abilities to have families. And two, our bodies had sort of jump-started this change that people don't usually feel until they're in their 50s or 60s or late 40s. That changes how your body exists in the world, right? And so this, for me, these constant moments of thinking about what does justice mean, the human right to have children, the human right not to have children, and the human right to raise the children that we have in safe and sustainable communities, all wrapped up in the notion of bodily autonomy, right? Demands that we ask different questions about the access that we have to healthcare, that move beyond issues of abortion, despite abortion still being so critical, right? Because what we know, especially in the state of Texas, is that when you curtail access to abortion, you also foreclose on spaces that are providing other kinds of reproductive health care, right? So then you deny entire communities access to other forms of healthcare, including pre and postnatal care. And you also make it so that pregnancy becomes much more dangerous, right? I did come from Iowa, although I have to say, just despite being in Texas, I'm a Californian. Let that be underscored and noted. I'm from the Bay Area. But going to Iowa was fascinating, and I was there for 8 years because essentially what's been produced over the course of like intense anti-abortion legislation over the last 7 to 8 years is that now we have maternal care deserts, right? And it's a very rural state. So where people have to either cross state lines to get maternal care, to get prenatal care, right? Travel sometimes 3, 4, 5 hours to a hospital. If the state is going to demand that you birth, right? They're going to force birth. What is your plan when there are no physicians? I was 50th in the country on access to OB-GYNs. What then, right? What is the sort of ultimate playbook? And so these kinds of questions for me, as I was writing my book, were just like front and center. And then the last issue that was so critical to me was the fact that as I was like, okay, I hear all of these archives, and I'll talk about my archival research in just a second, but there were not a lot of histories about Latinas and Chicanas specifically, and reproductive justice or reproductive rights or reproductive health organizing and movement building. And one of the few is a book called Fertile Matters by Elena Gutierrez. She's a sociologist at the University of Chicago. And then my other wonderful colleague, Natalie Lida, whose book came out a few years before mine, Laboratory of Deficiency, that looks at the history of sterilization abuse in California. And that was really it. There really wasn't a lot on Latinas. And as part of the burgeoning population, I was like, how do we not know about the history of our own reproduction and how it's been politicized in the United States? This is wild and unacceptable. And then as I started to kind of look at the work of people like Elena Gutierrez, she pointed to folks like Angela Pettucci Aragon, who's a sociologist, who in 2002 basically says, like, the reason why we don't have studies on Hispanic women or Hispanic feminist intersections with reproduction is because they fundamentally haven't been concerned with it. They've been concerned with other things, right? They've been concerned with safety, public safety, and adequate childcare. That's not reproduction. And so that's why there's not a lot of stuff, because they actually haven't cared about it. And again, as I went looking through my own research, I was like, that is fundamentally untrue, especially if the only framework that we use to understand their work is reproductive rights. Right? If that's the only way that we're going to understand the activism and labor and organizing that they've done, then that's a problem. And so again, it led me back to RJ, because if we think about reproductive justice, then absolutely they're involved, right? Absolutely. If we think about the human right to raise our children in safe and sustainable communities, then that is what they've been talking about for decades. And so what leads me to El Paso? I was fundamentally maybe not the most, how would I say this? I was very single-minded. I really wanted to study the history of women along the US-Mexico border, Mexican origin women, and that was it. It was very cut and dry. I didn't know how I was going to study them, their lives, but I knew I wanted to be along the US-Mexico border, so I only applied to one graduate program. It was the UTEP graduate program in Borderlands history, and thank God I got accepted, so that's where I went. And my interest was actually in looking at the history of femicides in Ciudad Juárez. So in the 1990s, there was this sort of, after the United States signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, they started to find essentially like mass graves in the desert. And overwhelmingly of women not just reproductive age women, sometimes very small, young girls, and then up to people in their 70s and 80s, but almost all exclusively women. I was very moved and disturbed by mass graves in the border region. And I wanted to go and investigate that and understand its history. When I got to UTEP, people were like, you cannot study this. It's still one, happening. And two, it's very dangerous, right? The Mexican government has essentially refused to look at these cases. And so, so you can't do that. You can't study that. Eventually I do. So if you do read my book and you go all the way to the last chapter, I come back around to that. Bless you. And so I was like, what do I do? What can I do? And at that time, the Planned Parenthood of El Paso clinic had just closed. And a lot of people thought it was Rick Perry. I know some of you may remember him. They thought it was attacked by Rick Perry. It was not. It was internal issues that the organization had. And I befriended the archivist at UTEP's library. And she said, look, we just got all of their papers from 1937. And actually they go farther back. They go back to 1917, when the originator of the clinic in El Paso, Betty Mary Getting, began to collect stuff on her work on birth control. So she's interested in it right when she gets married. She gets married in 1917. And she decides that she doesn't want to have children right away. She has a library degree. She wants to be a librarian. So she begins to correspond very early on with Margaret Sanger. So we have these amazing letters of her writing to Margaret Sanger at that moment. But so they have archives from that period all the way going up until the 1970s. And so she said, do you want to look at these for your dissertation? And I said, absolutely, 100% yes, I do. And that's what I spent the better part of a decade looking at, were files from Planned Parenthood of El Paso. Then that made me travel to look at things at the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College, because they have all of Planned Parenthood Federation of America papers, Margaret Sanger's papers, and I ended up spending a lot of time in the Northeast looking at these papers. But the problem was that they were exclusively written by the majority white women who had established the clinic in El Paso, right? They were almost like there was very little, if anything, from the women that they were purporting to want to pay attention to, right? They were focused from a very early period on the reproductive capabilities of Mexican origin women in El Paso. Why? Well, this is turn of the century. So this is an image from 1940s El Paso. In that period, there was a lot of migration from Mexico. This might sound familiar to some of you. There's increased migration after 1910 into South Texas, because there was a massive revolution in Mexico. So a lot of people moving into South Texas. And a lot of the Anglo communities in the region were scared that they would be overtaken by these quote unquote hordes of brown people. In addition to that, a lot of Mexican origin people were essentially doing all of the work that most Anglos did not want to do at the time, right? So from agriculture to cattle ranching to domestic labor for women. Women, and still to this day, it's pretty incredible, still to this day, something like 80% of domestic workers in places like El Paso, Texas, are overwhelmingly Mexican origin immigrant women, right? And this was the case then. They were laundresses and or working in the homes of Anglo families. And there was high infant mortality rates in the areas of town where these women lived. And so the justification for this concern of their reproduction was high infant mortality rates. How do we control the high infant mortality rates of Mexican origin women? But we don't want to pay them more money, right? So that they have better access to healthcare. We don't actually want to provide them better healthcare. And we do not want to provide any real infrastructure in their communities, right? So like access to drainage and sewage and all of the things that were causing rampant disease in their communities that were raising the high infant mortality. They're like, we don't want to deal with the structural problems. What about if we just give everybody birth control? And sure enough, Margaret Sanger comes to Paso in 1937, and she's like, I have it, this magical tool. As soon as we give everyone birth control, we're gonna end disease, we're gonna end poverty, and because she did believe in eugenics, we're gonna end all of these unfit people reproducing and having children. And this is their philosophy for a good part of the 20th century. This is a Spanish language newspaper from 1964. Too many births destroy the health of the mother, which again, like, it's not untrue, right? Like, if you do have too many children and have no access, no safety net to healthcare, yes, it can destroy your health. Like, yes, you're not going to be a healthy person, absolutely. But oftentimes this clinic was not concerned with providing people a totality of healthcare, but rather they were interested in just offering people birth control. And even in the early parts of the clinic being established, it was, the name of the clinic was the Mother's Health Center. And for the first few years, because there was no healthcare in other kinds of clinics, women would come with their sick babies to say like, oh, this is a Mother's Health Center. I would like to get care for me and my baby. And they would turn these women away. And so in the hundreds of meeting minutes that I read, at one point, I think it's like 1938 or 1939, one of the board members says, can we just please put birth control on the door of the clinic already so that people understand what we're doing here? We're not actually offering people, we're not helping mothers and their health. We're offering a conscious control of birth, right? And so then I go on to write about the women that came after. So at the same time that you have Margaret Sanger coming to town, you have the birth of Chicanas like Amelia Castillo. She's from Carlsbad, New Mexico, and she's a major Chicana organizer throughout much of the 1960s and 1970s in El Paso. She starts off as a social worker, but it turns out these are like the kind of people you definitely want in your camp. It turns out she's also like an amazing grant writer. And this is that everyone's like, oh, grants, you don't say. Yes, y'all. And it turns out that at this moment, when she really kind of, and she's one of the first Chicana social workers to get very prominent positions at the College of Mines, that then becomes UTEP, at the hospital, the Beaumont Hospital, which is at Fort Bliss in El Paso. She's the first Chicana social worker. So she's just breaking down barriers, you know, as she do. And she begins to hear about the war on poverty funds from the Johnson administration at the time. So here I'm pushing us all the way into the 1960s. And someone says to her, wouldn't it be great if somebody could write a grant that would get us some money so we could help establish our own clinic? And she begins to work with mothers in South El Paso who are part of this community who have been seeing these high infant mortality rates for decades now. And so she starts to work with them and she says, sure, let's see if I can get us some money. And in fact, in 1969, she writes that, or no, I'm sorry. In 1969, she gets a small grant. She gets like $3,000. They open a small clinic. And then it's in 1973 that she hits it big and gets what today would be the equivalent of like $2.3 million to establish, the Father Brown Clinic. The first clinic run by Mexican origin people in South El Paso. It's still around today, still there, still kicking. They had to change the name. You see, it says Father Ram. That was a Catholic priest in the city of El Paso who was like beloved. He had been there in the 1950s. He was a Jesuit priest who would ride around on a bicycle, and he was like really supporting the Mexican youths of the community. And then the bishop of El Paso was like, are you out of your mind? You cannot name this clinic that offers birth control and classes on reproduction. You can't name it after a Catholic priest. Stop. they fought the bishop on it for a few years, and finally they were like, fine, it's fine. And so now it's called Clínica La Fe, so Clinic of the Faith. So it still has the sort of undertones of Catholicism, but they were practicing and they were thinking about Catholicism in the sort of liberation theology vein, right? That it was something that was to be given, that was to be part of the community and of the people. And that's what Amelia Castillo was doing. I had the honor and privilege of interviewing her for my book. I did an oral history with her. And then she came out when I did a presentation about the book at the History Museum in El Paso last year. She had just turned 90. Okay, just so you guys see her, just as fierce as ever. Can I go back? Oh, no, I can't. Can I? Oh, I can. There she is. She looks the same. A wrinkle here, wrinkle there, but just fabulous and like incredible. And she had people in the audience crying because, you know, you had all these students in the audience like, what are we gonna do? Everything you made is just right. She's like, no, mijitos, we have to get back out there. We have to organize again. We have to do this work again, right? And she was like, this is why it's a movement, because we have to keep moving. We have to keep going. But she started a women's clinic within the Father Ram group that would then partner with newly minted Chicano doctors who were residents coming up in the local county hospital. And so she began to create essentially a hub of Chicana and Chicano healthcare workers in El Paso. And then she was an activist for most of the rest of her life. And actually working in geriatric care. And when I met her, she told me, and this is to get to the point of my archives, right? She said, listen, I know you just did this oral history with me, but also I'm wondering if you want to look at some of my papers. My kids want me to clean out the garage. They want me to throw everything away. Because they're like, oh, Mom, what are you doing with all these like old files? And I was like, settle your children down. Please don't touch anything. Let me go and look through these files for 1 second. And sure enough, it was her whole life's work. It was all of this organizing work that she'd done the better part of 40 years. That her kids were going to have her throw away. Mm-hmm. And I was able to have them be transferred to UTEV's special collections. And her archive became one of the first Chicana archives. And this is in El Paso, Texas, y'all, where it's like 87% Mexican American. And so to me, this was a project of love. And I'm going to stop it here because I know I want to have a conversation with all of you and Professor Rebouché. But like, I don't know, you know, and even as potential attorneys, right? I can't tell you how much of the work that I do is because y'all left a paper trail. At a time when AI is like on our necks and will completely explode what we understand to be things that have been documented as real, as things that actually happened and occurred, right? Thinking about the preservation of our thoughts and our words is so critical. I cannot underscore that enough. Even if your arguments that you're writing or an amicus brief or whatever, it doesn't make it through. It's an important moment in time that you must hold on to and care for and not let it kind of get taken out into the AI worlds, because that is so valuable to be able to continuously track how we're thinking about things, to look at Amelia Castillo's papers and to see the brilliance of her writing so forcefully for the dignity and humanity of her community in 1969 and 1970 and 1971, 72, to get her to get that huge $2 million grant in 1973. That is fundamental to who it is that we are as human beings. All we really have fundamentally is how we can conceive of the world on our own terms, right? And so I urge us to be more careful and more tender with what we write, because it's so precious. And we're all so fortunate to still be able to write and think for ourselves right now. And I'm just so thankful that Amelia Castillo's kids didn't throw all of her papers away. So I'm going to conclude there, but I'm looking forward to a conversation with you all in a few minutes. Thank you.
That chair should be just, or I can, you'll come back up.
Okay.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. I think we should give one more round. Really my honor to just set the stage for this conversation and offer a few comments on what is truly a timely and impactful book. I urge you all to get it and read it because it makes a significant contributions to the field of reproductive justice. And really centering the experiences of racialized communities, revealing how racism has been embedded in the reproductive rights movement. And it's, you just touched on what your archival research, but let me just brag about this research.
Oh, I did so much of the Benson too. I should have shouted out the Benson. Oh my gosh.
I mean, it is rigorous archival research that draws from oral histories, from patient letters, from these. I mean, it is truly a work of genius to capture what is a very complex, often contradictory set of dynamics around access in a region that has been shaped by colonialism, immigration, public health regimes, persistent racialization. And what I love about this book is that what emerges is this story of repression, but of resistance and resilience. And so it's truly a multidimensional portrait of the borderlands and these questions and these movements around reproductive justice. So I'm just going to put some themes on the table, and then we're going to have a chance to ask some questions. So the first, I think is what we were just discussing is situating the borderlands as a site of reproductive struggle. So I think a central innovation of this scholarship is conceptualization of US-Mexico borderlands, not merely as a geographic boundary, but as a critical site for understanding reproductive politics. I think this work reveals this simultaneous liberation and violence for those seeking reproductive health care along a spectrum. And the insistence of how the borderlands have long been shaped by racism and immigration, fertility control. I really appreciate the clear-eyed look at the left-right politics that supported population control. We tend to think about those moments as partisan, and they were not. And so thinking through how this racialization project had profound consequences for public health controls, this eugenic gatekeeping was designed to try to create a putative purity of an American family nation while generating long-lasting stereotypes, discrimination, and oppression for Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So struggle. Second, as I mentioned, really thinking very carefully and critically about the racism in the reproductive rights movement. I think this is just such an important contribution of this work, is its unflinching examination of how racism has operated within birth control movements, abortion rights movements, and demonstrating that activists, lawyers, and doctors in the United States strategically deployed racialized narratives about Mexican providers, Mexican origin women's fertility to advance their causes, even at the expense of embedding stereotype and discrimination and inequality. This free row specter of Mexican abortion became an incredibly powerful tool that US feminists, mostly white, deployed for their own ends. And I think that this captures that, you know, these racial scripts about Mexico and Mexicans were deployed to defend legalizing abortion in the United States, even as women's travel reports often contradicted these back alley narratives. So while white activists invoked racist stereotypes of dangerous Mexican providers, many of these same providers were offering safe, competent care to thousands of people. And similarly, the birth control movement in the Borderlands was explicitly framed as a form of eugenic feminism, a project where white activists championed contraceptive as necessary to protect the quote, and this was a phrase from the quality of the race. So this idea of birth control being a benevolent intervention to align Mexican origin families' reproductive habits with those of white middle-class Americans, even as that discourse fundamentally devalued their autonomy, fertility, their choices. Third, don't need to say a lot about this because I think this is going to come out in a Q&A, but the recovery of marginalized voices and experiences. This method, you know, the methodology of a book, and I've read your articles that do the same thing, just putting on, you know, making visible, making audible the voices of people who were not part of the mainstream reproductive rights movement, and recovering the agency of Mexican origin women navigating coercive reproductive health systems. So just as you heard, although birth control campaigns deployed this idea of uplifting the poor, records show that Mexican origin women attended clinics in large numbers, returning repeatedly for services otherwise unavailable to them. And the book illuminates what this tension between coercion and choice, where women were exercising agency within the systems designed to control them. So I love that the story about the Catholic Church is complicated in this area. You have clergy, community members challenging birth control campaigns, not only on religious grounds, but by exposing their racist and classist underpinnings. Community members immediately recognizing the connections between birth control and broader systems of racial control. And it's a perspective that anticipates reproductive justice before it's called reproductive justice. And then fourth, the work that transnational networks are doing and how they are limiting and are limited by national frames. So I really appreciate a lesson in the inadequacy of US-centric frameworks for understanding reproductive history. Feminist activists created formal transnational networks connecting US patients to vetted Mexican providers, maintaining quality through patient surveys and ongoing communication. I mean, these networks are operating in an underground economy where abortion providers, activists, patients, referral services are working in concert. So I think this idea really situates the notion of what abortion travel is. And it's not a 2026 phenomenon. So this, you engaging with scholarship and patients and people and their oral histories beyond the US border. And then that's the fifth and final theme that I just want to put on the table is it's the books and really all of your work. It's how much it has to say about connecting historic reproductive politics and contemporary struggles. So Dobbs, who's heard of Dobbs, right? So Dobbs overturning Roe and 50 years of that precedent. Activists and advocates and people are again looking to Mexico, to providers, to to feminists for assistance, and this makes this analysis urgently relevant to present conditions. Because the book affirms that while access to reproductive health care remains a prerequisite for women's emancipation, the history of how that access was provided cannot be separated from its eugenic and racist foundations. So reproductive justice offers a way forward, tying abortion, contraception to global frameworks, to human rights frameworks. I want some questions about that. This scholar, but it's contributing this historical knowledge within a moment where we're all thinking and talking about what are the political interventions post-Dobbs and moving forward. So I think that this book insists that any reproductive rights movement worthy of its name must reckon with the experiences and leadership of racialized communities. So it was such a joy to read this book, and it's been a real treat to be able to offer some of the themes that really stuck with me. But now I would love to hear more from you. So come on back up here.
Come back up. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Why don't I kick us off
Yeah.
with a question?
Should we sit up here? I just feel like weird that we can't. Should we just have a conversation about this? There's some chairs.
Right in front of the, right here.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we have about 10 minutes.
I love it. You're like, stay on camera, people.
You could roll on it. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about the methodology, but collecting oral histories, the papers.
Well, I'll just say this. It was wild because I was not always being a good historian. In that especially in the third chapter of the book, I do use a lot of theory, which is historians are notoriously anti-theory. But I wanted to make sense of the kind of disparate voices that I had of some of these women. So like, for instance, I was looking through the footnotes of Chicano historians who'd written their, some of these like incredible texts 20, 30 years ago. And I like trying to find like, wait, are they talking about birth control? Or some of these early, Chicano historians who've written like the history of Mexican Americans in the United States, how are they mentioning birth control? And some of them would in the footnote. And so I was like tracing footnotes and found these interviews of these two women. This is in the 1930s, who were done. They were done by this Mexican anthropologist who was looking at like labor movements of Mexicans going into the United States. And so one of his interlocutors interviews these women who were labeled as sex workers later by historians. But then I'm reading their interviews. They're not sex workers. They're just young women who were taxi drivers, which is a term used to, or taxi dancers, excuse me. Taxi dancers, very different than drivers. Taxi dancers, and that was women who men would pay them a dime in a dance hall, and they would dance with them for a song. And that's how they made their money. And so later on, historians had interpreted that as they were sex workers. I'm like, there's a huge jump between that and sex work. But I think the reason they were labeled sex workers is because these women very openly talked about their sexuality and their desire to have sex with some of the men that they met as taxi dancers. But they talked very forthrightly about not only their use of birth control, but how wonderful they felt to be independent, that they had moved to the United States because of the Mexican Revolution, and they were living a different life, and they felt very free to live this life on their own terms. And they talked about some of the people in their family and the young women in their family, but the historians who had engaged these women's interviews from the 1920s and 1930s had just kind of like thrown them to the side. right? Like, oh, these are just sex workers talking about, this birth control app. Who cares? We'll cite it and then move it right along. And I was like, no, this is like a rich, like, moment in time to think about like what sexual liberation looks like in the 1930s for women of color, in a way where they are speaking. And these are interviews that were like written down verbatim. And that's kind of where I was like, I'm going to go counter to what some of my elder colleagues have understood about what these women are saying. And that then helped me track other moments, right? So it was about like asking different questions of sources that already existed, and then having the opportunity later on to interview women who are in their 80s and 90s about their own reproductive understanding of their lives. And again, incredibly sophisticated analysis of why some of them had decided to use birth control, often kind of couching it in the like, I'm about to tell you about my use of birth control, but just so you know, I'm a good Catholic. And I love being a Catholic, and these are the reasons why I like being a Catholic, but also I did not want to have 10 kids. Like, I just didn't want to. And as soon as I understood that I had access to like a diaphragm, I jumped on it. But I had 5 kids, and I love my kids, and I treated them well, and I've given them the best education that I could. I did all of these things, which that was more important to them in their connection to Catholicism than having all the children that they were, whatever. And so it was like, okay, here's all this, like, great. Like, what do we do? I was just lecturing to my students who are taking a class on women's reproductive health. And I said, that's the thing about the history of reproduction, is that we have allowed these partisan conversations to kind of wash out the complexity of people's human experience. And that actually these conversations are not black and white. There's so much gray. And rather, I should say, there's so much color to them, right? Like, there's so much complexity and color to them. And I think that these partisan conversations dilute the potency of our human experience, right? And the complexity of our lives that can't have us just line up easily in one camp or another.
We have about 3 minutes.
Sorry, that was very long.
No, I just want to make sure maybe
Oh,
we
yes.
get a couple
Yeah.
questions from the audience. Maybe group them together and then we can end with Professor Murillo. Does anyone have any questions?
You talked about how, post like Roe, we're turning back to look at Mexico and we're turning to look at them more. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little more, on like how that relationship sort of changed from before, where maybe that history was being ignored, to now maybe people are turning towards that history. Maybe, I think it was mentioned. I'd love to hear you
Yes.
elaborate on that.
And I know, because I'm trying to fit one more question, but I'll just say quickly, it's really important. People in the Borderlands region, and for those of you who have grown up maybe in the Borderlands region, have always known that healthcare, right? Whether you're like US-Mexico border or US-Canada border, like being able to travel outside of the United States to get access to healthcare is not anything. People do that all the time, right? Why? Because it's so expensive to have even most basic access to healthcare. So people go get their dental work, chiropractic work. I've heard of people getting, their cataracts done, all of this stuff done in Mexico, in Juárez, in Tijuana, in Piedras Negras, because it's less expensive. Access to reproductive healthcare is no different, right? There's an organization in Mexico, people have been writing about it extensively, Las Libres, right? They have actively created nexus between US people searching for access to abortion and the work that they're doing. But yeah, all of a sudden people are like, wait, and this is more like on the East Coast. I was getting a lot of journalists from the East Coast being like, is it true that people go to Mexico for healthcare? I'm like, what do you think Bernie Sanders has been like screaming about, right? And he's talking about it from the Vermont perspective, from people going to Canada to get access to healthcare, but this isn't new, right? And so it was just making those connections.
I have a question, kind of just looking at, again, this nexus between religion and reproductive justice. I think that's a really interesting thing that you touched on a lot. And in the US, of course, we see a lot of evangelical Christians and being staunchly anti-abortion, sometimes anti-contraception. And I just kind of want to know if you've done other studies or found anything about kind of the difference between the way that evangelical Christians look at things and the way that Catholics look at things, and like where the line is being drawn, because clearly in these Mexican American communities, like the women were able to find space to also have this thing that seemed to go against their religion, but we're not seeing that now for a lot of people. So just kind of want to know your thoughts kind of on.
I will say this, the Catholic Church, despite its very, like, they have these encyclicals that come down from the Vatican that say essentially how Catholics are supposed to behave. In the late 1960s, what happens with the Catholic Church is that so many people are using the pill, and like local priests are like, guys, what are we gonna do about this? Like, people are actively using it a lot, right? And so they take all of these concerns up to the Vatican, and the Vatican compiles this committee on population concerns. And the Committee on Population Concerns essentially is about to give the Pope the like sad news that like we lost it on birth control, like it's contraception, it's out of our hands. But somebody, and I would love to write more about this, somebody gets in the Pope's ear and says like, no, you can't go back on these encyclicals that have been part of our, for the last canon for the last hundreds of years, because you're gonna like dilute the power of the papacy. So he walks it back and says like, yeah, we're still against contraception. But again, the cat's out of the bag. So there's always been this like permissibility for the Catholic Church where they're like, we know, we say no, but it's more localized. The evangelical is that they were anti-abortion, but it has a lot to do with racism in the United States, right? Where they actually were like, we're not getting people on like segregation anymore. They wanted to start all these schools in the South that were like segregated and under religious grounds. That wasn't winning arguments. So they were just like, what can we do to kind of coalesce the power of essentially the power of the conservative right, because they'd lost so much power after the civil rights movement. And so Phyllis Schlafly, if you don't know who she is, just a genius of anti-feminist kind of organizing. Really, it's her and a couple of other people get together and they say, actually, abortion could be an issue that we could really politicize to bring all of these other conservative concerns together. Right, so they really build that movement in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and then it catches fire after Roe, right? Because then the federal government has essentially the constitutionality of it. There's something to rally against, if you will, right? So that's why we get these sort of diverging conversations around Catholicism. And then now Catholicism is coming back because they're losing ground with the evangelicals. And now you have these like hardcore right-wing like Catholics that are coming out and saying like, no, we've always been opposed to abortion, which is true, to be fair to them. They have always been opposed to it. But now you have like way more extreme right-wing kind of Catholicism coming up that hadn't been seen like for a long time in the United States.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, you guys.